Welcome to Building the Open Web podcast. The new episode is with Jesse Walden. Jesse, nice to see you today.
You too. Thanks for having me.
Maybe you can actually start with your background. Where did you grow up?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I grew up in New York. There is a sort of interesting story about how I got into crypto, which I could tell here. So I got involved with crypto in 2013 after reading the Bitcoin white paper, like a lot of people. But my read of it, I think, was fairly different than most. In that, what I sort of gravitated towards in the Bitcoin white paper was the fact that here's another peer-to-peer protocol that is in some ways very much like BitTorrent. And so to me, it sort of harkened back to an era of the internet that I was sort of close to, where piracy was really rampant. And so, of course, like most teenagers in the early 2000s were involved with piracy, but my own experience was, I think, a level or two deeper than most everyone else, and that everyone was downloading, but I was part of a group of people who were uploading the files and ripping them. Movies, music, TV shows, and this was like before Netflix, had streaming. This is before YouTube existed and Facebook existed. So these piracy channels were the dominant way to experience media online, sort of before social media and all that. And so I was deeply involved with that piracy community, and in some ways it's kind of similar to the crypto community, that is very incentives driven. You had to sort of maintain a ratio of uploads to downloads to get access to all the world's stuff, and also there were some like common concepts, like in the piracy world. If you released a movie that was low quality or lower quality than you said it was, you would get nuked, which is kind of like being slashed in a crypto network, where you don't do the work you're supposed to do correctly. You get your tokens taken away from you. In the piracy world, you get your credits taken away from you. You get booted from the server. So the reason I tell this story is that there is a connection to how I got involved with crypto, and that is what I saw in Bitcoin was sort of a protocol innovation that did something that all the piracy protocols did not. So FTP, BitTorrent, ultimately HTTP, were all protocols where files were transferred, and that was sort of a mainstream phenomenon. But none of them had a identity mechanism baked into the protocol, and so there was no place for the community of people who were exchanging files to interact with one another directly. That all happened sort of out of protocol, and ultimately that's what led to the creation of social media platforms, which bundled together the ability to distribute files like a photo or an image or video with a profile, and the ability to communicate with other participants. And of course, that was a very good idea. So what I saw in Bitcoin when I first read the paper is, wow, here's a peer-to-peer protocol that allows you to transfer data to other people in the network, and that's through the blockchain. But it also has an identity primitive built in, and that's public-private key cryptography, which is what allows everyone's Bitcoin to be attributed to them, to the rightful owner. And so I thought, hey, that's pretty cool. What if you took a system like that and applied it to tracking a different type of digital asset? So instead of a financial asset, what about a digital media asset, like an image, a video, or a song? Well, if you could do that, then all the world's media could be attributed to its creator, and the creator could be discovered anywhere that media is distributed, just like a Bitcoin is yours, no matter what platform you use to interact with the network. And so that was the sort of spark for my journey into the space, and ultimately what led me to co-found a project called Mediachain Labs, which had the goal of building an open and universal media library, as we called it. So that was my entry into crypto. That company got acquired by Spotify. I led blockchain R&D there for a while, and then I joined the investment team at Andreessen Horowitz, where I spent the last 2.5 years roughly focusing on startups in this space. And now I'm working on a new startup of my own. I'm going to be continuing to invest and partner with early stage entrepreneurs in the space. But yeah, there'll be more to come on that soon.
Got it. And how did you consider getting into entrepreneurship in the first place when you were starting Mediachain Labs? Was it with a friend? Like, how did you consider that you can just start a company?
Yeah, I think I've always had an entrepreneurial bug. So I've really never held but before Andreessen Horowitz and Spotify, I didn't really hold a job anywhere else. I always was sort of hustling on my own thing. So that goes back to, as soon as I got out of high school, I went to university in Montreal, and there was a really amazing music scene happening in Montreal at that time. And given my involvement in piracy, I was a huge music fanatic because I just, listened to all the albums on the internet or some, or tried to anyway. And so as a fan, I started getting into the local music scene there and ended up starting a concert promotion company. So I was booking artists I wanted to see, having them, come to Montreal, perform, and producing the concert, promoting the concert. That led to artist management. So I wanted to work with the artists in a deeper way, and I also wanted to scratch my sort of technologist bug and help artists use these new technology platforms, both the piracy channels, but also the new and emerging social media channels at that time, to run their businesses independently. So to help them reach their fans directly without having to go through the major label system. And so that was another business that I started, and I ran that for a while, and that I was doing that up until starting Mediachain. So the through line, I think, through my career has been, constantly starting new projects, and the connection between all of them has been really about getting creators or artists, founders, the value that's due to them. And I think like crypto is a really powerful technology for enabling that. So that's sort of how I decided to start Mediachain, and what's sort of led me down this path.
Mm-hmm. And then, like, so you started with Bitcoin initially, and then you spent quite a bit of time in Andreessen, and then your own entrepreneurship journey before this, before crypto and in crypto. So how do you think the space changed since your initial kind of read on it and where we are today?
Oh yeah, so much has changed. I mean, like I think every 2 years in this space is like a decade in any other technology vertical, because of how fast things are moving. So back when we started, which was 2014, there were sort of two dominant narratives in the space, and you know better than anyone how important memes are to the evolution of crypto. So the memes back then were one that Bitcoin was going to be the blockchain to rule them all because it would take on these insurmountable network effects. And so, all developers wanting to build cool new things with this technology would build it on top of Bitcoin. That was one narrative. The other was that the interesting thing about blockchains was not Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies, but the blockchain itself. And that was a very sort of like enterprise adoption story, right? That like big banks or big industry consortia would come together and use this new database technology to improve the efficiency of their business. And at Mediachain, we believe neither of those things, because we were not building on top of Bitcoin because it just didn't work for the use case that we had in mind. And we also didn't really believe that enterprise was where the first adoption for this technology was going to come from. And so we were always targeting developers, independent developers, and we built a protocol in hopes that that the next wave of developers could build the next Spotify, build the next Instagram, and build those platforms in a way that was more aligned with the creators that make those platforms valuable. But the challenge back then was 2014 to 2016. There weren't that many developers active in the space, and so it was a really small market, very very little activity, and that all changed in 2017 when Ethereum first came on the scene, in a big way. So Ethereum had been live for a while at that point, but the ICO wave sort of drove a lot of speculation and also a lot of developer interest. And at that point, we were already at Spotify, who was interested in the enterprise blockchain use case that they had in mind for our technology. But with the sort of rise of Ethereum and all the activity happening on those public networks, there was sort of a new opportunity within Spotify to start doing some research on what could be done outside of the enterprise use case and more in the world of public crypto tokens. I don't not much of that has seen the light of day, and ultimately that's why I decided to get back to the space. But I think one of the big learnings and things that changed in 2017 was the realization that programmable economic incentives are this general new tool that can be used for tons of different applications. So obviously, economic rewards are what are at the core of the success of Bitcoin and Ethereum. But I think the ICO wave of 2017 at least posited the idea that it might be much more broadly applicable to all kinds of applications and services. And I think the sort of favorable treatment of the ICO boom was that for the very first time, the technical unlock of tokens was made accessible to developers. And that enabled them to surface latent demand in the market that was really difficult to see beforehand. And that is the consumer demand to actually own a piece of the products and services that you might use every day. So I think that's really what happened in 2017 is that it was the first time everyday internet users were offered the opportunity to participate economically in the success of platforms that they contribute to. Um, so I think that's one takeaway you could learn from that era, and I think we're now in the phase where we're trying to figure out how to productize that, how to make that intuitive for those internet users to understand, because a lot of what was promised in 2017, of course, was not realized. But I don't think that's because the opportunity doesn't exist or was wrong. I think it's actually the opposite, that this latent demand is real and validated by the fact that 8 of the top 10 crowdfunding events in history happened in ICO crowdfunding, and now it's sort of up to the space to sort of figure out how to turn that into an intuitive product experience for internet users to actually use every day. So those are some of the different waves I've been through, and I'm sure there'll be many more that we are hard to think about today.
Mm-hmm. And maybe we can also talk about some of the themes that you've published or thought about. So maybe we can talk a little bit about notion of blockchain as computers.
Yeah, so this is a theme that I think the team at A16Z has done a really, really good job of articulating. In particular, Chris and Ali, I think, have written great posts about this. But the basic idea is that the simplest way to think about what a blockchain is as a new type of computer. And in order to get to that conclusion, it's helpful to go to the very basic definition of what a Turing machine is, right? So Alan Turing invented the first computer, and a Turing machine is basically a machine that you can give an input to. The machine runs some function on that input, gives you an output, and records that output in the state. The state in this case is the blockchain. And so blockchains meet this very basic definition of a computer, but they're different from most other computers in that they're not physical computers. It's not like a mobile phone or a server or a laptop. They are instead virtual computers that run on a network of physical machines all over the world, and those are the miners or validators. And those physical machines sort of work in concert to form this one single virtual machine. And on most dimensions that you would assess a computer, blockchains to date haven't been that awesome. They they like don't fit in your pocket. They've been kind of slow and expensive to use, but they do excel on one particular dimension, and that is the dimension that of trust, because of the sort of cryptographic guarantees, the open source code guarantees, and then the economic and game theoretic guarantees of these platforms. You can trust that the network of physical machines is going to do the work of running code, running applications correctly, because there's a high penalty to misbehaving and running malicious code. So trust is an important sort of new computing primitive, because it means, one, it unlocks new applications. One for application is digital money, and so like Bitcoin is a very application specific blockchain computer. It does one thing really well. It does digital money, store of value. Ethereum was first to sort of generalize the blockchain computer, so from an application specific computer to a general Turing complete computer. And that's kind of like the evolution from calculators to PCs. You went from specific to general. But the idea here is that you can have many more types of computing primitives. For example, computing networks dedicated to storage, and all of these offer really high degrees of trust. So beyond cryptocurrency, you can get new applications that depend on trust. And critically, those applications inherit the trust guarantees of the platform itself. So that means that each application can be a trusted building block that third-party developers can build on top of and extend, without fear that the rules are going to change on them, or that building block is going to get yanked from underneath them. And that's super important because that's exactly what happened to Web 2 developers who built on top of platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Spotify, where at one point each of those platforms had really rich developer ecosystems, in some cases more activity happening in third-party apps than the official clients, only to see the rules get changed and that whole ecosystem sort of come crashing down. So blockchain computers offer these trust guarantees, and that's important to developers because it means they can build much more with fewer resources because they can build on top of the work that others have done before them. So that's I think the right way to think about blockchains and why they matter. And the thesis around why this space is so exciting is it means that if developers can build more with less, then this could really be the biggest wave of software innovation ever, because it combines the sort of best properties of open source, which is extremely productive, with economic incentives to run open source code as a service and allow anyone to permissionlessly innovate and build on top of it. So that could lead to very rapid sort of compounding innovation.
So it can also be kind of thought as almost a continuation of open source movement that existed for a couple of decades, but essentially now it has this, like, you kind of suffered from like tragedy of commons, right? You actually had a content about it, right?
Yeah, a lot of people often conflate crypto and open source, and it's true they are intimately related in that all crypto networks run on open source code, but they are also different in a very important way that's often misunderstood. So open source code is only valuable when you take the code, copy it, and run an instance of that code as a service. So to make that concrete, MongoDB, for example, is an open source database. And the value of MongoDB, the company, is in the business that they do, which is they take that open source code library that they've contributed to and thousands of other people have contributed to as well. And they copy it and they run it as a service for their clients. So the value of open source code is captured by the services that instantiate the code and run it as a service. Each instantiation of a MongoDB database is sort of a siloed instance. So your MongoDB database has nothing to do with mine. They're two different instantiations, and they capture value differently. And that's critically different than what happens in crypto. So crypto networks also rely on open source code, but the difference is that a network of people all over the world download and run this code together. And the result is a single instance of a service. So there's one sort of Bitcoin network. There's one compound money market on top of Ethereum. There's one Ethereum, one Near. And like open source code, you can fork the code and run your own instance. But that doesn't necessarily mean you've captured the value. Just like a new instance of an open source code library doesn't capture the value of a MongoDB database that's filled up with data or users or both, right? So it's the one instance of a crypto network where the value is captured. And in many ways, that's very similar to the model for traditional Web 2 businesses, in that there's one Uber network, there's one Airbnb. Each of those are instances of a service where the value is in the data and the users interacting with that service. Crypto networks are the same in that it's an open source foundation, but you have this one instance where all the people in the network are interacting with one another. And it's very hard to copy that and coordinate everyone to move over from the canonical instance to a fork. And that's why crypto networks can capture value, whereas open source code libraries don't. They need to be instantiated as a service to do so. So crypto networks are live running services, and open source is not by default.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And also, maybe we can talk a little bit about the kind of emergent playbook for how to think about starting a startup and like progressive decentralization.
Yeah, definitely. So this one's like a little bit controversial in the community because of sort of the origin of crypto, and of course Bitcoin started from a cypherpunk mailing list, and I think for the application of a non-sovereign store of value, starting decentralized first was critically important, right? So you had Satoshi write the white paper, but then you had a community of open source contributors build the code out. and then a very early small group of miners running the network. And as this matured, it became more industrial and more decentralized, and that's what reinforces the security of Bitcoin today. That model, I think, is hard to replicate for many sort of applications building in the space today. And so there is an alternate path, which I've been calling progressive decentralization. And that is where a team that's focused on building an application in this space runs a playbook in the early days that's kind of similar to a traditional startup, in that they focus first on building a product that people want, and really trying to find product market fit above all else. And in service of that, you often need to have a lot of control over the product. So decentralization can kind of get in the way of finding product market fit because it slows down iteration. And when you're trying to find product market fit, you want to be able to update your assumptions quickly, iterate your product quickly, and you don't want to have to, do design by committee for every decision that needs to be made. So, so during the earliest stages of building an application in this space, you might want to consider, retaining centralized control in order to find product market fit faster. That said, if you're going to take that approach, it's really important to communicate that that's what you're doing, so that there's no false pretense of decentralization when that's not really the case, because that's a really quick way to undermine trust in a community that values decentralization and transparency. So yes, step one is all about finding product market fit. Once you have early signs of it, then it's time to start running the decentralization playbook. And the first step there is to focus on community building. So if your product is facing developers, there's a lot of best practices out there on how to build rich developer ecosystems. Focus on things like great documentation, tooling, meetups, community managers, etc. And yeah, there's a well-established set of best practices there. But focusing on community is critical in crypto, because the third and final step in this playbook is that ultimately you want to turn control over to that community. And the reason that you want to do this is community owned and operated networks are, by definition, sort of have the potential to grow much larger than their corporate counterparts, because they have this more cooperative economic model, where the community members, by virtue of owning a piece of the network, are highly incentivized to contribute to its ongoing development, and to build on top of it, because they can trust that the rules of the platform are not going to change against their will, because they ultimately have a say in how the application works and evolves. So yeah, that's the rough playbook. Is first product market fit, step two is community building, and then step three is figuring out how to effectuate a distribution of ownership and control to the community. And I think it's very often the case that that's easier to do once you have real users in a real community, because you can start to work with or look at the data on who's contributing what, and design your distribution effectively to reward past contributions and forward looking contributions as well. And one of the, I think there's a few benefits to this approach. One of the benefits is that founders can focus on the right thing at the right time. So the death of most startups is death by many cuts and division of focus. So being able to focus on each of these stages independently and sequentially is valuable. The other benefit is that I think this approach offers a path to possible regulatory compliance. So there's not a ton of clarity on this, but we do know that there's problems with running a token sale, and here the benefit is of taking the progressive approach is you don't have a token in the market until you've already built a product, built a community capable of running the product, and then demonstrated that the community is capable of taking over control and ownership. So that alleviates one of the key tenets of U.S. securities regulation and the Howey test, which is dependence on the efforts of others. By the time you've distributed a token in this model, there is no dependence on any single other entity, because the community is operating the service at that point. So ideally, you've achieved sufficient decentralization by the time a token is at play, and hopefully that is a better way to remain compliant, which again is important because it allows founders to focus on what really matters, as opposed to having to deal with all the overhead of issuing a security. So that's a playbook I think that a number of teams are following in the space, and early indicators are that it's working out well for them. So I think this is a model that's going to become more and more common. And yeah, I've written about it in more detail, and I'd love to hear from teams who are executing on this to get feedback and validation on how it's working for them. I think actually you guys at Near have run a similar playbook in a way, in that you've been heads down for a couple of years building the layer one blockchain, and then in parallel, once the foundation was sort of set, building a really robust developer community around the protocol, and then recently moved to testnet, right, with a sort of a promissory distribution of tokens. It was an incentivized testnet, and that showed that, hey, the community can actually run this thing, right? And now you're at the point where you're getting ready to sort of effectuate a distribution of real ownership to the community when you go to full mainnet and enable token transfers, right? And that's not something that you guys will do, but rather something the community do, which will do, which again reinforces the idea that the protocol is actually community owned and operated at that point.
Exactly. And so how do you think about also this rise of cooperative models? Because they're kind of like not that popular maybe in US, not many people know about them. You've done some research on this, like essentially like very different business model.
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I'm no expert on the history of like cooperative enterprises. There are folks who are like really deep in the research around sort of corporate design and governance design and so on. But I did sort of take a preliminary swing at learning more about it, because I started to, as I started to view blockchains and the applications being built on top as these community owned and operated services, I started to think, well, what are other examples of community owned and operated things in the world? And the first thing that came to mind were cooperatives and mutuals, which are traditional organizations that have been around for a very long time, that are owned by their members. So the key difference is between a cooperative and a corporation is that a corporation is owned by shareholders, and shareholders have sort of one interest in the company, and that is the maximization of profits. That's sort of by definition what the corporate bylaws are set up to do, is to maximize shareholder profits. A cooperative or a mutual can have different goals, because the ownership is distributed among members who can define the value that they want from the organization any way that they want. So, for example, there are some cooperatives that are actually quite big businesses. Like REI, for example, is a multi-billion-dollar cooperative that makes outdoor equipment and gear. And it started sort of as a small community project where a group of outdoor enthusiasts wanted specific hiking gear and rock climbing gear that they just couldn't find on the market. Nobody was making it. And so they thought, okay, well, why don't we want this stuff, and we know that it's valuable to us, so why don't we pool our resources together to be able to manufacture this stuff at scale, and make the production of it cost efficient for us ourselves. And so that was the origin of REI, which is now this multi-billion-dollar cooperative. And if you ever have been to the store, you can go in and become a member for $10, and that membership entitles you to a discount on purchases in the store. So that's one of the benefits of being a member owner of the co-op. And in addition, as a member, you also get a distribution of the company's or the cooperative's profits at the end of the year, which is again one of the benefits that the members have sort of defined. They have agreed that any profits will be distributed based on how much you spend at the cooperative each year. And they've also, I think there's also an environmental mandate. So the members have decided that something that they value is environmental activism, and so some of the profits are routed there. And I think this is instructive and sort of a good analogy for how to think about crypto networks, because again, crypto networks are also community owned and operated, and so that means that the community can define what they want out of a crypto network. It could mean, in the case of Bitcoin, that they don't want there to be any additional issuance of any other Bitcoin, so everyone knows, that their Bitcoin is truly scarce, and that's how the Bitcoin community defines its values. And in other, more developer-facing platforms, it may be that you want all the computation in a network like Ethereum or Near to be done correctly and execute as specified every time, and for there to be, minimal changes so that you can trust each of the applications running on the platform. So I think that that's the, a helpful way to think about how crypto networks work and why community ownership is important. And these analogies to traditional cooperatives are useful because I think crypto can learn a lot from the way those organizations are managed. So, a big open question for crypto networks is how do you scale up community decision making to like internet scale? And in the case of these large cooperative organizations, many of them have elected governance structures that resemble traditional corporations. So REI has a CEO, it has a COO, it has a board of directors. But what's different is, again, those members of the management team answer to the member owners of the cooperative, and so the owners can replace the CEO if they're not delivering on the values that the community specifies. So that's nice because it's a way to ensure the community is represented, but also a way to scale up the efficiency of decision making through a more traditional and familiar hierarchical system, and which may be may be optimal for some crypto networks. And I'm sure there'll be lots of experiments in other governance designs that are newly possible because of crypto, but this is certainly a good place to start, I think.
Mm-hmm. And given these new models, like how if you were to put like young founders and put yourself in their shoes, how should they approach fundraising?
Yeah, so on fundraising, like one at A16Z, a lot of the deals that we did there were structured as traditional equity deals. So like what you typically would do as a startup founder outside of crypto, but with one very important difference, which is that those equity deals came with an option for tokens should the team go on to produce them. So this structure I think is useful because it allows for the most alignment between founders and investors. So at the earliest stages of any crypto project, any startup project for that matter, there's a lot of things that are uncertain, right? And starting a startup is all about sort of validating your assumptions and eliminating as much uncertainty as possible. You need full range of flexibility to do that. In other words, you don't want to be committed necessarily to launching a very straight, narrow, specific product because you may learn new information that causes you to shift gears and build something else or pivot your product, right? And so our view is that equity is the best tool for early stage founders because it gives the founding team a lot of leeway to change and pivot the business and doesn't sort of marry them to delivering a specific product, as might be the case if you've promised investors a token in a specific network, right? And so I think the view at A16Z, and one I agree with, is that equity is the best sort of way to structure early stage deals in this space, and it's also a fit with the progressive decentralization plan I outlined earlier. So, raising capital from traditional and hopefully sophisticated investors is a good way to like get the support that you need as an early stage founder, and also critically like focus on building your product. So rather than having to deal with the overhead of issuing tokens early, which can potentially trip regulatory wires, and then manage a very large community of token holders right from day one. Raising money from private and sophisticated investors is a way to sort of really maintain a focus on what matters at the earliest stage, which is finding product market fit. And then when later you start building a community and eventually sort of decentralized controls of the community, then you can focus on producing the token and distributing the token. And at the same time that you distribute it to your community, you can also distribute it back to investors such that they can realize a return on their investment. So I think that's becoming increasingly sort of best practice for investments in this space. And I think it offers a lot of benefits both to teams and investors. And that it maximizes alignment, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I also wanted to ask about like what it means overall for crypto to go consumer and kind of like this productization to happen.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of I touched on this earlier. I think the latent demand, there was latent consumer demand exposed by the ICO boom of 2017, and that was the demand to own a piece of the products and services you might use every day. I think technologists and crypto enthusiasts have realized and understand that potential very well. They're sort of the first communities to get on board with this idea. But given the right tools, many more communities are poised to follow suit. And so a good example of this is Reddit just launched their crypto token project where these two big subreddits are going to be tokenized, and the community is going to earn the value of those tokens based on what they contribute to the subs. So that's an example of sort of community ownership in a mainstream consumer product. And I think we're going to see many, many more examples of that as the tools mature. And today I think we're right on the precipice of the infrastructure and tooling being ready for prime time. Namely, we have solutions to abstract private key management from end users. And I think that's really important because the experience of interacting with consumer apps powered by crypto needs to rival the experience of Web 2 apps. And then the other important building block, I think, is stablecoins, because volatility and dealing with finance and investments it's not something that everyone wants to think about all day. And so a familiar medium of exchange in the form of a dollar or a euro or whatever your local currency is, I think is an important building block to start experiencing ownership or value from the platforms and services you use every day. And so now we have both of these in market today. So I expect we're going to see a lot more innovation at the consumer layer of the stack. And I'm really excited to work with entrepreneurs that are exploring that.
Mm-hmm. Lastly, I kind of wanted to mention briefly that you spend a lot of time thinking about curriculums for founders and while building A16Z crypto school. What do you think was the most important learnings from there? What's important for founders? What did you learn yourself?
Yeah, I built with the team at A16Z, built out this curriculum for crypto startup school. A lot of the things we talked about today are covered there in more depth. So encourage founders to check it out. I think one of the interesting learnings for me actually was in a talk given by Brian Brooks, who's the former chief legal officer at Coinbase. Now he works for the U.S. Treasury, and he, independent of my research on cooperatives, actually landed on a similar conclusion that that cooperatives and the sort of regulatory implications or regulatory precedent set by cooperatives may also apply to crypto networks. And so he was able to, in some ways, validate an intuition that I had from my preliminary research. And he did that completely independently and with his legal background. And so that was a big, learning for me. And that I'm very excited for that episode of the class to come out, because hopefully it can be a big revelation to others working in the space and trying to figure out how to, deal with the regulatory matters that projects are facing.
Mm-hmm. And finally, where can people find more about you online?
Yeah, Twitter is best. I'm Jesse WLDN, which is my last name with no vowels, and jessewalden.com.
Sounds good. Well, thanks a lot for coming today, for building the Open Web podcast episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thank you for listening. You can find more episodes of this podcast at openwebcollective.com. If you're a founder looking for help with product, go-to-market, or fundraise, apply on the same exact website. It's openwebcollective.com. If you really like this episode, I would really appreciate if you give us a review on a platform of choice where you listen to podcasts to. And finally, if you're on Twitter, we are at OpenWebFounders. Again, the handle is at OpenWebFounders. I'll see you next week.